Excited to pick your brain on all things AWS, so we'll start there. So you have an interesting background in company in that you guys help with bills. And I think when you say that out loud, it's like, okay, billing's not that exciting. But some of the things that we've talked about that I think are so fascinating are the unintentional ways that you've found breaches through billing.
Security and billing are definitely on the same axis of problem in that both of us wind up getting customers when someone somewhere wakes up one morning, looks at something and says, oh, shit, and it goes rapidly downhill from there. They care about something right after they should have really cared about it. Fortunately, in my case, it's only money. When you're in the security space, sometimes it's a little bit more than that. I will also point out the only way to get, as you mentioned, decent observability into an AWS environment, start to finish, is the bill. Everything else is region bound. It has its own special console, so every account is effectively 31 different accounts. And oh, that thing in that other part of the world, never heard of it. It's basically a SaaS product or infrastructure as a service product that takes an American understanding of geography. It knows about none of those other places because we've not recently been at war with them. And then it just goes ahead and assumes, oh, if you knew what you were doing over there, you'd be there instead. I have had at least one engagement where we ask questions about suspiciously high bills around requests for Route 53. Officially, that is Amazon's managed DNS service. Here in reality, we all know better, it is the premier database offering that they've got. Because anything is a database if you hold it wrong. And DNS is an excellent candidate for that. I mean, you have lots of answers. I can ask you things. Congratulations, you're a database. So when you start seeing that massive volume, you don't tend to approach this from perspective you're doing something wrong. You're doing something interesting. Could you tell me about it? And they took a look at it and turned sort of ghost white on the Zoom call, and we'll talk another day, because suddenly they had something way more important to do. It was a relatively sophisticated data exfil in progress. But where's the system that tells you that you're losing all of that data? In this case, AWS charging per request. You wouldn't think of the bill as being security observability, but compared to the crap-ass state of a lot of observability in the cloud natively, it's a place to start.
Do you think there's a really big divide in security and observability when it comes to these things? Because if you think about from the perspective of a detection engineer or someone looking at logs, you're not going to see things like billing and metrics inherently in logs. Do you think we should be merging the two a little bit tighter?
I don't think the way that it works today lends itself to that. At this point, when you wind up doing a thing in your AWS account, maybe it's a smart thing, maybe it's a horrible thing, maybe it's irrelevant, it will show up in the bill at least 8 hours from the time that you do it reliably, sometimes as long as 72, because it's basically racing continental drift. When you're talking about audit logs and looking at things from a security perspective, like at that point, you are likelier to see the update about your security incident on the front page of the New York Times if your company is big enough before it shows up in the bill. So is it great at holistic and understanding what's been going on? Yeah, but it's been going on for a while before you see it reflected in money.
Where do you think are the biggest offenders in AWS services when it comes to security? You mentioned Route 53 is one, but what else?
That was atypical. Honestly, anything that is sufficiently complex to be difficult to configure is one of them. IAM is an easy gimme on that. For years, S3 was an easy example as well, because originally in their console, you could click a box for permissions and say any authorized user is able to read and write from this bucket. What people assumed, naively, because why wouldn't they? Oh, that means in my AWS account. Nope, any AWS customer. Oops a doozy. And the checkbox was right there as a landmine waiting for you to fall onto it. Now they've fixed that. They added a bunch of scary warnings to do it. They used to have a column in their console that warned about buckets that were open. They've since removed that console item just because I guess it's a cleaner design. And good news, we've solved security. Back to making money by selling cloud services again. I don't know why they did it, but it does make it trickier to see at a glance, somewhere in here I've done a dumb. Where does it live?
S3 continues to be the vector of choice, right?
You can use it as anything up to, legitimately, including a database. It is a data warehouse. You can misuse it as a file system like people love to do. You can use it as a message queue, which you really should not do, but that's okay. I don't respond to well-intentioned advice from people who know what they're doing. My two programming languages of choice remain brute force and enthusiasm, and it carries you surprisingly far. I would say that, look, from a security perspective, the thing that is easily the biggest one, though, EC2. It is the largest service by a lot, and even though it runs somewhere else where you're charged by the hour for it, you're still in a situation where it's a server running an operating system. You need to patch it. And as we've demonstrated over the last 30 years, we suck at that collectively as an industry and as a species.
Where do you think AWS can get really clever with Gen AI to help with their own inherent security posture?
They've been talking about it to a point where it's completely drowned out everything and everyone talking about these things. They've have an automated reasoning group for years that has done programmatic proofs that these things do what they say they're going to do. But there are still periodic issues discovered because, in this weird circumstance, there was one that Nick Frechette at Datadog Research came up with recently. When you remove amplify, it left around some roles that now anyone could assume and cause some problems. That's a weird confluence of things. They fixed it. They did a write-up on it. But that's the sort of thing that even the magic robot that seems to know everything, that may as well be from the future, can still get it wrong. And that's the problem. On some level, if they didn't have that group, would they have subjected that entire process to more scrutiny rather than saying, the robot has gotten there? I don't know. I've never spoken to that group directly, and they're very good at what they do, clearly. But did having that AI assistant breed false confidence?
What else has AWS been releasing that has been really interesting from a security perspective? Features or new services? Like, what's been recent and exciting on that front?
They've decided to put one of their versions of Q. They have 15 different AI services now, all called Q. It's like Amazon's simple queuing service is not what people thought it was. Oops. And so in other words, they have a chatbot that enthusiastically gives wrong answers to things on their webpage, which is certainly a choice. And when it first came out, I wound up asking it a bunch of questions and getting some interesting hallucinations back. Hallucinations are what we apparently have decided as a society we're calling it's lying to me. So at this point, when someone winds up lying to me and I catch them on it, I can accuse them of being hallucinating. That'll go great. But it talks about upcoming region launches that aren't real, or if they are, no one at AWS is willing to let me know that they leaked. But it's sort of the same problem you have across the board with Gen AI, is that it doesn't like to tell you you're misunderstanding this or you got it wrong. It's like, we're playing a game of let's pretend. I'll play along. Why not? And that is an odd thing when you start seeing it on a company's website. When you ask it for things now about your use of AWS billing, it'll say, what are my most expensive services? It'll tell you. Sometimes it'll also get it wrong. I asked how much I was spending on VPC peering yesterday, and it told me $80 some odd. The correct answer was 0. But there was something in the VPC category costing that much, and it just figured that must be what I was talking about. If you ask it, what is my AWS bill been for the last 3 days, it'll give you an answer. It lies, because people assume when they hit enter, okay, from this point, now. Remember, 8-hour eventual consistency model. That period of time will change as you wind up looking at it back over the next week.
It's a good strategy, though, for the AI to tell you something lower than the reality,
On some level, I think this is part of the problem you have with billing across the board, and you probably see it with security, too. There's an over-indexing on being correct to the penny before presenting data to someone. What I care about a lot more is that I normally spend $5 a month on this AWS account. I've done something ill-advised involving credentials and GitHub and maybe beer, who knows? And now suddenly it's charging me $60,000 an hour. I want to know that as soon as possible. I don't want to wait for you to figure out, well, is it 58 grand or is it 63? It's orders of magnitude difference. So that is, I would like to see faster response on things directionally. It's the same reason we shift things left as far as we can during the CI/CD process. If you, are really bad at programming, can't imagine what that would be like, and don't know what a linter is, you might wind up trying to iteratively deploy things with, I guess I need a comma or a semicolon there. That's good to know. You don't want to wait 3 days for that to come back and tell you that's the fact. You want it to be almost as soon as you save the file, if not before, or at least on a commit before it winds up getting pushed up. You're in flow. You're thinking about this stuff in the moment, not trying to remember 3 days later, what change did I make? And having to do the worst kind of archaeology. What moron did this? And of course it's me, just I'm not thinking in the same way now as I was back then.
So taking a step back, you do a lot of work on AWS, obviously. You have the publication streaming in the cloud. Where did that name come from?
What I normally do on a weekly basis is the Last Week in AWS newsletter, but I wanted to be able to have a interview show where I could talk to people about things tangentially related to the business of cloud, which is intentionally overbroad. If I give it the AWS branding, then I'm not going to get people from Google or Microsoft or other companies that view it as a competitive issue. And I've had execs from all of those companies and more on the show. It should give some sense that this is not just going to be the typical, well, not to insult your corporate podcast, but oh yes, this is staged by an elaborate marketing team, and there's a script that everyone reads. They try to do the funny voices, but it's basically a bad dramatic reading of talking points, because lots of companies fall into that trap. I just want to have interesting conversations with people doing interesting things in our sector. And that's not hard to find, as it turns out. I'm coming up on episode 600.
Wow, 600. How did you become really interested in cloud and tech, and what was your story getting into the industry?
I was a grumpy Unix systems administrator in my early 20s. I was also old at the time because I was working on Unix. And it instantly ages you. And at some point, I started seeing the sea change. I started off doing large-scale email systems administration, which was fun and exciting, but it was pretty clear that not every company was going to need someone to do exactly that with the rise of things like Gmail and yelling across the room, or Slack, or same thing. And okay, let's find something else to focus on. I did configuration management for a bit until immutable infrastructure took over. But as I went down these paths, I kept realizing that there's certain things I would always hand wave away. I don't really understand what's going on over here, so it's probably fine. That's where growth lives if you dig into it. I wound up learning how networking works one year during the Great Recession because no one was hiring, and I was stuck at a job that wasn't really evolving. So great, I got my CCNA. Oh, that's why the network works. Followed immediately by, how can that possibly work? The more you learn about it, the more you realize it runs on magic and vibes. But same thing with cloud. It's okay, great. I wind up running this one command. A server spins up over there, and for some godforsaken reason, CloudWatch charges me $700. What is A to B to C? How did that unfold? And then when I was doing that at various companies that I was doing DevOps team management on, and in some cases just doing the in and out consultant to fix things and get lost, it was always annoying to have to deal with bills because it wasn't planned work. It was something I wanted to get the hell rid of and pass to someone else, but it was dropped on me like a seagull of a boss, just crapped all over me with that project. Awesome. What do I do with it now? I wish there was someone I could just throw money at to make the problem go away. And AWS says, well, you could throw money at us and we'll be back, we'll go away till next month. It's that doesn't really solve it for me. I couldn't find anyone like that, so I figured I'd give it a shot. It was either that or go down the security path when I decided this 7 years ago, but only one of us gets woken up at 2 in the morning because of a giant screaming problem. There are no billing emergencies at 6 a.m. It is a curiosity only.
Something that you said to me before we started recording today was that thinking about the evolution of problems through an organization's scale, starting at SMB, going to enterprise. Mm-hmm. Enterprise is not just a big SMB and vice versa when you think about the problem. So how do you think about approaching a company and helping them that's an enterprise versus helping an SMB when it comes to cloud?
Increasingly, we've been focusing on exclusively enterprise just because the problems are so divergent that it almost doesn't make sense. An easy example of this is back when I started doing this, let's talk about security, for example. I was a big believer in, SSO, that's expensive, SSO.tax, if you're interested in a fun website, all the companies that call out being charged explicitly for this. And all right, I'm just going to use one password. I use a unique password for everything. That is my SSO equivalent, and it worked super well for me. And then we started hiring people, not all of whom used password vaults like this. And I'm sure someone was reusing a password at least 15 different places. At that point, you need something to start managing people. That was still going from one to several. And there are iteration step changes like that all along the way. I mean, over in the AWS billing land, for example, if I were to look at your cloud bill, I'm going to suspect that I would see the majority of the spend being on one application workload that probably also shares the name with the company, if I had to guess. But in large enterprises, you might see a $300 million annual bill, and the largest application workload is $2-3 million bucks. They just have 1,500 of these things. It's a very long tail. It's not about architectural optimization anymore. It's how do you make sure people aren't doing things irresponsibly, that they're conforming with our best practices, which align with security very tightly. How do we plan about this? How do we reason about these things? How do we figure out that what we're paying is the right number? It's not actually about saving money, whereas for SMBs, it very much is.
So with enterprise, it's more about the investment and the return on the investment.
Exactly, and the relationship longer term as well, because at large scale, giant companies are doing so many different things in so many different directions that it's hard for sometimes to just introduce people to each other. I still joke half seriously that half of my job now is introducing Amazonians to one another because they wouldn't meet otherwise.
In a lot of ways, I mean, it's the same in security. As you get into the enterprise, small changes can save millions of dollars, but it can also reduce your footprint. Do you ever give customers advice on doing this, like reducing their footprint to both reduce their spend and reduce their potential blast radius?
Absolutely. I also at times tell them to spend more on certain things. If you tell me that a one S3 bucket is critical to your business and you'll be lost without it, okay, so you can't move it to infrequent access one zone, great. So where's it backed up? And if the answer is nowhere, it's I suggest spending more money on that, given that it is far likelier that someone on your end is going to accidentally type in the wrong bucket parameter and blow things out than it is for AWS to irretrievably lose an availability zone. So yeah, spend the money on fixing that. The rest of it is often looking at the bill. It's okay. Normally you start to expect certain things, like the top 5 services are pretty common between companies of where the spend is going. Okay. Now, what's this other weird thing? Why is config a third of your bill? Oh, because it charges a tax on using the cloud dynamically when you provision and deprovision stuff. You know, you were sold on being elastic with the cloud. Well, that's the tax on what you were sold.
What about when it comes to spending on security services? Do you ever recommend people do things like guard duty, S3 access logs?
Oh, God, here we go on that one. I did the math once on this, and in most cases, if you enable every AWS security service that they offer, it costs more than the breach it's defending against. So honestly, at this point, you may as well just acquire a business relationship somewhere with a company that's credit monitoring and just prepare to pass that out when you get breached, and you'll come out ahead. The problem is these services don't integrate with each other particularly well. It seems for a long time that if you launched a service in AWS, ideally but not always, it could understand other accounts in your organization or different regions, but never both. And suddenly that's starting to get fixed, but it's this aggregation issue. I have an application that runs currently in 17 different regions, which means I now have 17 different CloudWatch log groups I have to care about unless I want to sync them somewhere responsibly. It's not security centric, otherwise I'd be a little bit more actionable about it than sitting here lamenting how bad I am at this stuff. But it is definitely something that causes concern. There are no real benchmarks for what companies should spend on security, but as one example, CloudTrail data events. It will show up every time you do a get or a put into an S3 bucket. But that data event in CloudTrail will cost me 20 times more than the API request that triggered it. So at some point, bring money.
What's your MVP recommendation for people listening?
Understand what the data is, what you have to be sensitive about and what you don't. This is the same thing I always did for compliance back when I worked in finance environments. You can actually have a whole bunch of ridiculous nonsense in your environment, and that's fine. It's not that onerous. You just take the things that are regulated workloads and you silo them off, and you have significant access controls around who's able to do it, what they're able to do with it. Once that's segmented away, then worst case, the disaster scenario is a lot less damaging. I mean, I do an awful lot of stuff publicly. I have a separate AWS organization entirely for that, with the globally unique alias of shitposting, because that's what I use it for. There's nothing sensitive in it. I'm not going to expose customer data or a private preview if I take a screenshot in that thing. Worst case, it's my own stuff, and I basically deserve everything that happens to me next afterwards.
So we're here at RSA, and have you been around the expo at all? Is there anything that caught your eye this year?
Not this year. I've gone several times in the past, and frankly, I just got tired of people trying to sell me a firewall as they have for the last 30 years. This year, it seems like they've all pivoted toward AI. I was doing an AI firewall. That's how you bridge past, present, and future all at once. But historically, I'm not really the target audience. A couple of years ago, I walked around and saw no fewer than 15 booths trying to sell me something for XDR, whatever the hell that means, because nobody bothered to expand the acronym. I think it's an audio cable format.
I think you're right, actually. That is what it is, yeah.
It's effectively people using buzzwords to speak to other people who are deep in those buzzwords, but where I've always come from has not been deep in the security space. I have to care about security, but the term security is nowhere in my job title. It's just something that comes along part and parcel. Like we say security is everyone's job, but we don't act like it as an industry. Stop trying to sell to me as if I were already as knowledgeable about the space as you are. Like there's a lot more people who don't quite understand this space as potential customers than people who are on your level. You have to meet customers where they are. Otherwise, you wind up with early Google, where their entire sales pitch more or less distilled down to, so our engineers are smart and yours aren't. Otherwise, they'd work at Google. So we now have services for you morons. Surprisingly, this was not a compelling go-to-market strategy. They had to shake some things up to start seeing results.
Do you think that Google's acquisitions and the way they've positioned themselves has made them better and more conscious on security?
They
so
talk about security more, which is useful. Well, AWS historically has been very tight-lipped, other than here's what we do. Here's the shared responsibility model, which is basically a 45-minute way of saying if you misconfigure something and get popped, it's your own fault. But you can't say it that directly to someone who just got breached. You need the 45-minute talk with the slides and the storytelling, and ideally you can work a tortured metaphor into it somewhere.
So a lot of companies are sort of spinning out certain AWS services. Do you think that's going to continue to happen, like to specialize?
Spinning out in what sense?
Like databases, like use Snowflake and Databricks as an example, competing with Redshift.
Oh, yes.
Do you see this a lot in other parts of the cloud environment?
A lot of them, yeah. Oh, it depends on the aspect we're seeing. It makes sense in that Redshift is not just incredibly expensive, it's also not great at its task. So the fact that other folks are like, we have better ways of thinking about data warehousing is something that we're starting to see a lot of. And like, for example, it's always weird seeing that the Redshift team in particular despises the Snowflake folks. But Snowflake's a giant AWS customer. Where do you think the data lives? The AWS's larger perspective is, well, the data is going to live in our left pocket or our right pocket. Do we really care which? Now, the Redshift team hates them with a vengeance, but everyone else is like, yeah, great customer. They're terrific. They have them in keynotes and whatnot. So on some level, forget like individual companies spinning off things to compete with AWS. AWS themselves does that all the time against their own products. I did a blog post once, 17 ways to run containers on AWS, where I listed 17 different services that could be used to run a container. And people thought that was amusing. They stopped laughing when I wrote the sequel, 17 more ways to run containers on AWS. And I had to stretch for the 17 final ways. Yes, that is 51 different services, in theory, that can be forced to run a container. Some are designed for this. Some can be misused in this. But it's definitely like one, for example, was I complained about a problem publicly with AppRunner. And an AWS employee saw that and jumped in as what they do. And they ran the thing, saw the web server on it, was just serving a single static image with the old troll face image, captioned, way number 14, trick an AWS employee into running the container for you. To which their response was, well played. You have to have fun with it.
Of course.
They do that as a service too. How many different key value stores or ways to pass a message between your AWS account and my AWS account are there? Without being ridiculous, I count no fewer than 15.
I use Route 53 for it, so.
That is one of the more ridiculous ones, but it still works. You could use SQS, you could use SNS, you could use their managed Kafka service, you could use one of the Kinesises, Kinesi. We have a name that kind of works. Let's name 5 more services that. Honestly, they have 40 services, all starting with the word SageMaker, because someone over there is empire building and apparently good at it. Like, why is all this new Bedrock Q stuff not part of SageMaker? Different empire builder. The dueling feudal lords are angry.
So before we go over to our audience for some questions, what are 3 pieces of advice you can give folks listening and in the room on AWS security?
Oh, dear Lord.
Just 3.
3. I wasn't aware there'd be a test. One of them is understand why things are the way that they are. If you don't understand why something is configured, find out why. I mean, Chesterton Spence teaches us don't yank it out without not understanding why it's there, but dig into that. 2, it's annoying because they make it sound way more complicated than it is, but set up IAM Identity Access Center, Access Identity Center. They keep changing names on the thing formerly known as AWS SSO. I point mine to Google Workspaces, but then you're not having long-term credentials cluttering up disks somewhere and causing disasters. And 3, if you have the opportunity, something I've done is I've instrumented a bunch of my systems with Slackbot alerts. One of them is ClickOps detector, where if someone does a writable action in the console, which is called ClickOps, where we claim to use do infrastructure as code, but then we use the console and lie about it, ClickOps. When that's what someone's doing, it's not necessarily bad, but I want to know that it happened because now we have a divergence. Like, understanding what is going on in your environment is the hard part, and that is something I think people take far too lightly. AWS is confusing. What could we possibly know? Yeah, that's why you need to understand what's going on in your account.
And Amazon Q should help with that, right?
It sure would be nice if it did, wouldn't it?
It doesn't?
No, at this point, it's basically early. They're terrified of being perceived as being late to market, so they're shipping things before they're baked to prove that they're late to market.
It's a good strategy.
Yeah. It's also a popular one increasingly these days. I have this old school, old-fashioned philosophy of don't ship things to customers until they're ready. But, I suppose that's not how you become a multi-trillion-dollar company.
Move fast.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Maybe it's just a wrapper around ChatGPT. We'll never know.
I would be not completely surprised to figure out that it was, if not that, something similar.
Well, it's being the subprocessor, though, right?
The real question, though, is great. So where were all these things trained? Because right now, forget working on whatever your cloud provider of choice is. You're going wherever you can get the GPUs. Because apparently, this is NVIDIA's moment to shine. Before this, the last hype wave was blockchain. People were super into crypto. Now, the same people have pivoted to AI. I just assume they're NVIDIA's street team, and they've got one hell of an affiliate program. People are like, we don't care what you do with a computer, just make sure it uses a lot of GPUs.
Let's just go back to gaming.
Exactly. I figure that is the next thing where it goes full circle.